For defence firms around the world, I think it's fair to say the 2020s have been interesting times. The Russian 2022 invasion was a massive disruptor, crashing a major supplier out of the market, surging demand, and shifting global perceptions on what a country needed to consider itself defence ready. Last year, we looked at arms export data from 2022 and 2023 to see how some of that disruption was playing out, with the United States in particular emerging as a pretty clear winner in the market. Now, once again courtesy of SIPRI, we have data for global arms exports in 2024, meaning today I think we have a good chance to ask a question. As diplomatic fissures continue to open between the United States and many of its allies, and traditional buyers like Canada or the nations of the European Union look to potential alternative suppliers, where did the global arms market actually stand going into 2025? And what might that mean as we go into what is already a very eventful year? To do that, I'll start with some quick points around the data and methodology I'm using before jumping into a kind of 2024 overview. Then we'll dig a little deeper into the data for some of the world's major arms exporters: Russia, the United States, European exporters, the People's Republic of China, and a couple of honourable mentions. Finally, I'll add a couple of points around what this data might be missing, and also some of the potential trends we might see play out going into 2025 and beyond. But before we start unpacking the arms market, a quick word from a sponsor. Keeping up with news and international events can be difficult at the best of times, especially in a world where it can feel like geopolitical realities can shift in days and weeks rather than years and decades. And in that context, it might be difficult to feel like you're keeping up, or that you're seeing stories from multiple angles. If we flick through headlines on the US halting intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians, for example, you might quickly see a difference in what information different sources decide to put front and centre. This one highlights the potential impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself, while this one references US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz to imply the pause could be highly temporary, while not elevating the potential battlefield implications. The tool being used to quickly flick between headlines here is Ground News. By reportedly drawing on something like 50,000 sources around the world, it can help you quickly see some of the different ways a story is being covered, all while also giving you potentially useful context for that coverage, like ownership information and factuality ratings reportedly derived from the work of 3 independent news rating organisations. And along with all that, Ground News also provides interesting tools like one of my favourites, the blind spot feed. What it can essentially allow you to do is try and surface stories that don't receive much coverage in the kind of sources you would ordinarily consume, something which might help give you insight into what other parts of the internet are seeing and reading. Obviously, no single tool can overcome issues like online echo chambers and their effect on public discourse, but I don't think that means we should ignore the potential of tools that might help. So if you are interested, there will be a link in the description that will offer you a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so a few notes up front on everyone's favourite aspect of these videos: sourcing and methodology. Most of the data on international arms transfers used in this episode comes from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. As many of you will already know, this data isn't expressed in US dollars, but instead in Trend Indicator Value, TIV. And as a measure and a data set, that has a couple of advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it's meant to adjust for inflation. So hopefully when values go up, it's because of what's being shipped, not because Dmitri's salary at Orlov Vagon Zavod has taken off like a meme stock. On the flip side, it's important to understand the data doesn't count everything. SIPRI are an NGO and think tank, not a spy agency. And so the data is sometimes going to miss secret transfers unless we later get public evidence of them. And it also doesn't try and count everything. Major platforms like tanks, aircraft and ships are in, missile systems are in, but a lot of consumables and munitions, like small arms ammunition, artillery shells, or FPV drones, are out of scope for the data. In the context of a very artillery and drone-heavy war like Ukraine, that means we're getting a lot of the picture, but far from all of the picture. The final point up front is that because this is delivery data, it's inherently backward-looking. Under peacetime circumstances, there can be a very long delay between a country deciding to order a weapon system and it actually being delivered. And even in a wartime setting where a country wakes up and goes, oh no, the country's on fire, that still might only be enough to transform a very long wait into a merely long one, if you're willing to pay rush pricing rates. Given that, to give a better picture of what the market might look going forward, I'll occasionally bring in secondary data sources, with perhaps the most common data point being that company's order backlog. Because if a company's deliveries slumped a bit in 2024, but its production line is more or less booked out until 2045, we probably shouldn't be in a rush to write their corporate obituary. Those notes in place, let's talk about the international arms market in 2024. You don't need to watch particularly much news to understand that 2024 globally wasn't a particularly peaceful year. According to the IISS, global defence spending increased by 3.5% in real terms in 2022, another 6.5% in 2023, and then finally another 7.4% last year. The increases were particularly acute in the European Union, where member states have now reportedly increased defence expenditure by more than 30% since 2022. But in terms of actual tracked arms deliveries, all of that additional expenditure didn't really translate into a huge amount of additional volume. In fact, the SIPRI database actually shows a decline in deliveries in 2024 compared to both 2023 and 2022. As you can see on screen here, the overall trend is still slightly upwards over time, and 2022's levels were already a massive jump over anything we'd seen for more than a decade. But as an observer, it still might feel a little odd to see all of these conflicts raging around the world, and yet somehow be told that arms transfers were comparatively flat. Not being able to ship more arms while there is a massive conventional war on in Europe does seem like the kind of thing that should get a couple of marketing people fired. But as for why we've seen this drop in 2024 and 2023 compared to the 2022 peak, I've seen a couple of different explanations put up, some of which have more support in the data than others. For example, I've seen the argument that deliveries dropped off because Western nations ran out of stuff to send to Ukraine. And so after rushing everything there in 2022, the numbers started to drop off. The problem with trying to use that explanation here, though, is the SIPRI data actually shows deliveries to Ukraine going up. The data shows transfers to Ukraine increasing by roughly 46% between 2022 and 2023 as more heavy weapons were authorised for shipment, and then by a further roughly 20% on those levels in 2024, although it obviously remains to be seen whether that pattern will hold or reverse in 2025. Potentially more relevant has been the de facto exit of Russia, formerly the world's second largest arms exporter, from the international market. Between sanctions, risk concerns, diplomatic issues, and of course the need to prioritise Russia's military production for the Russian army, the amount of Russian supplied material reaching the market has declined precipitously since 2022, which obviously plays a role in potentially bringing the numbers down. So too do some nations deciding to prioritise domestic requirements over international sales. If governments perceive their neighbourhood is getting a little rougher, maybe they decide it is time to get some self-propelled artillery for home defence, just as the founders intended. But if I was to nominate a couple of reasons why I don't think we've seen arms shipments take off in the same way budgets have, I'd nominate firstly supply constraints, where customers want more weapon systems as quickly as possible, but suppliers simply can't produce them fast enough. 2023 and 2024 have seen some very high-profile cases of supply chain bottlenecks choking off supply, whether that be rocket motors for missiles, energetics for artillery shells, or a bunch of other issues. There have just been limits in how quickly firms can translate increased orders into increased output. What that means is we've often started to see major defence contractors developing larger and longer order backlogs. Many of you would have seen the report in early 2024, for example, that NATO was going to support a joint procurement for coalition members of about 1,000 Patriot PAC-2 GEM-T missiles. That's the kind of order quantity that could really move the needle on the entire market if it was somehow delivered all at once. But given the reported production rate for those PAC-2 interceptors in 2024 was around 20 missiles per month, working towards 35, orders like this obviously don't get handed over all at once and seldom in the year that they're made. And that point around delivery timelines really segues into perhaps statistically the most important reason the 2024 data looks the way it does. As a rule, global arms transfers are, for lack of a better term, quite lumpy. There usually aren't that many super high-value transfers in any given year, and they're not normally distributed over time. So if you have a couple of major delivery timelines that just happen to come together in the same year, you can absolutely get a bump, and then the next year probably a trough. In fact, I'd argue that statistically speaking, one of the big reasons we saw a bump in 2022, as you can see on screen here, wasn't so much anything to do with the war being fought in Ukraine, but just the arms delivery scheduling of two particularly cashed-up Middle Eastern buyers, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. If you compare 2022 to 2024, transfers to just those two nations fell from 6,431 TIV to 2,263. That's a reduction of 4,168 against a reduction in the overall worldwide dataset of only 4,935. As for why, it's just that 2022 was an unusually big year for Riyadh and Doha. Just two of the deliveries that went to Saudi Arabia in 2022 were worth more than all of their deliveries received in 2024. 110 M1A2 Abrams from the United States, which is a lot more than the 31 older M1A1s that Ukraine received, and 3 frigates from Spanish shipyards derived from the Avante 2200. Qatar also received European-built warships, in this case frigates and corvettes from Italy, but the big blip was caused by them taking a bit of an Ash Ketchum approach to Western fourth-generation fighters. In that 1 year, they received 8 Eurofighters from the United Kingdom, 6 Rafales from France, and 12 F-15s from the United States. And while yes, Ukraine was receiving much, much more material in terms of raw numbers of vehicles, for example, a lot of that material was very old, near to the end of its service life, and valued accordingly. Modern new-build Western fighter jets, however, follow a premium pricing model. So if you take the gotta-catch-'em-all approach, the data's going to notice. The reason I bring this up is to stress that when you see arms industry data, and especially transfer data, it's usually important to look deeper, because it doesn't take much to skew results, and sometimes the most intuitive explanations, it's all Ukraine, aren't necessarily the best explanations. It also leads into discussing another way in which the market has been shifting. The main buyers are changing, or at least their relative importance is changing. What I've done here to avoid some of that lumpiness is group arms transfer data into 4 3-year periods: 2011 to 2013 before the occupation of Crimea, 2014 to 16 immediately after Crimea, 19 to 21 before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and 22 to 24 after Putin's special military maneuver. And what you can see across those 4 time periods is the percentage of total arms imports accounted for by 3 traditionally very large arms importing states: India, the People's Republic of China, and Turkey. Between 2011 and 2013, just those 3 states made up almost a quarter of all imports. And India, at nearly 16% by itself, was by far the world's largest importer for that period. All 3 of these states, though, have something in common. They've all been trying to push towards greater self-reliance in arms production. And that may be part of the explanation for why we've seen a crash in their total share of imports in 2022 to 2024, where the 3 states combined now account for just over 8% of the total, nearly a 2/3 reduction overall. Obviously, future data may be lumpy, and some major purchases could potentially shift the Indian or Turkish data in particular, but it's still a major shift in the demand side of the market that you can imagine suppliers are probably paying attention to. As Indian, Chinese and Turkish demand has fallen, deliveries to Doha and Kyiv have gone through the roof. In those years leading up to Crimea, Qatar took less than 1% of total imports, and Ukraine was literally a rounding error, and in total, actually a net arms exporter. Cut forward to 2022 through 24, and the 2 nations collectively accounted for more than 20% of total global imports, roughly 7% for Doha and 13% for Kyiv. Add a couple of other increasingly important buyers like Poland and Kuwait, and you're accounting for more than a quarter of all track transfers in 22 through 24 in TIV terms. That's significant because those nations obviously have very different supplier preferences compared to the likes of China and India, and because the weapons being received by Ukraine have a fairly direct impact on the fortunes of the first major arms supplier I want to discuss. Let's talk Russia. As you can probably imagine, being locked in a sustained war of attrition while under international sanctions hasn't done fantastic things for Russia's once thriving arms export sector. Russian state media has found a way to put something of a brave face on the experience, putting up articles like the one on the right there, with the headline reading, quote, "Russian arms exports reached $211 billion in 2000 to 2023 sales. Russia continues to reap huge profits from its vast arms export system overseas, according to data from Rosoboronexport," end quote. While using all of the data from 2000 to 2023 is certainly a creative approach, a cynic might suggest that it's intended to conceal the fact that in 2023, as we discussed last year, Russian exports had a bit of a shocker, and in 2024, we now know the slump very much continued. Between 2011 and 2013, Russia shipped on average about 8,300 TIV per annum. By 2019 through 21, that annualised figure had fallen more than 55% to about 3,675 per annum. In 2022, it fell by another roughly 30%, and then collapsed by nearly a further half to 1,329 in 2023, about 16% of where it had been a decade earlier. We then saw levels remain basically unchanged in 2024, with a less than 1% increase. That wasn't enough of an increase for Russia to avoid a new milestone on the arms export ladder. In 2023 and 2024, Russian exports weren't just below the likes of Germany and France, they actually fell narrowly behind those of Italy. And if you read a little bit further into those 2022 deliveries, you'll see some other factors that might be concerning from a Russian perspective. The first is that Russia's list of significant buyers is now very, very concentrated. Almost 90% of transfers in 2024 went to only 4 countries: Myanmar, Kazakhstan, India, and Belarus. And just 2 of those nations, India and Kazakhstan, accounted for a clear majority of the overall pot. That's potentially concerning from a seller's perspective because the fewer buyers are in the market for your stuff, the less competition there is among them, and the more danger you are of being put in a scenario where the buyer, not the seller, gets to name their price and conditions. Another potential point of concern, although obviously there's always going to be a lag between order and delivery, is that basically none of this stuff was ordered after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some of these deliveries related to contracts going back as far as the 1990s, and the two largest deliveries, to India and Kazakhstan, related to 2018 and 2021 agreements respectively. And if you're a potential buyer, you might be nervous about putting yourself in the Russian sales pipeline because you don't know how long the war in Ukraine is going to last and what sanctions are going to be in place after it concludes, one way or the other. And while the data on deliveries is pretty bad, the picture for new orders is absolutely abysmal. In 2024, the largest new order that SIPRI tracked was for 12 additional Sukhoi 30 fighters for India, but that wasn't even for Russian-manufactured jets. It was for the licensed-manufactured Indian version. Similarly, there were major orders for jet engines that will be built in India, reportedly from majority Indian components. After that, you're pretty much down to Mali ordering one additional light transport plane. There were some deals struck in 2023, and there might have been some in 2024 that we're not aware of yet. In particular, we'll come back to a potential sale of the Sukhoi 57 in a moment. But for a nation that was once the world's second largest arms exporter, that's a pretty sparse sales pipeline. It might be a pretty clear demonstration that potential buyers of Russian equipment are keenly aware that as long as the war in Ukraine continues, there are risks associated with trying to source weapon systems from Russian industry, and until it ends, there's a fairly understandable chance that you might not get your stuff, because the overwhelming goal of the Russian defence industrial base at the moment is to produce as much war material as possible, as quickly as possible, for use by the Russian military in Ukraine. And that impetus is having a massive impact both on what kinds of equipment they build and refurbish, and also what their revenues and profit look like. It might sound strange to talk about arms companies having financial difficulties in the middle of a conventional war, but you have to remember that pre-invasion, foreign sales were a major part of some Russian firms' financial model. They'd sell stuff to the Russian military itself on the cheap, if they knew what was good for them, and make up some of the profitability on the foreign sales side. With the pivot towards domestic war production, Rostec has seen a massive surge in revenue, but a collapse in profitability. According to numbers provided by Sergei Chemezov himself, the head of Rostec, revenue from arms production in 2023 reached approximately $22 billion, which from memory I think is about a 50% increase on the year before. And for the record, projected revenue in ruble terms in 2024 was reportedly projected to be north of 3 trillion rubles, up from 2.84 in 2023. Net reported profit, however, was only 2.12%, including civilian production, and it was suggested those profitability calculations didn't include all relevant costs, and the company might actually be losing money on arms production. Part of the problem is a massive increase in inflation, especially worker wages, while another is the Russian defence sector is now carrying very high levels of debt in a very high interest rate environment, to the point where Chemezov reportedly said in relation to the interest rates, quote, "With such a key rate, of course, it's just madness. Any contract becomes unprofitable for us. Taking loans at such an interest rate means we will go bankrupt in a short period of time, and will again come to the government with an outstretched hand and say, give us more money to save our production," end quote. Part of the way the Russian government has tried to keep its defence producers going, despite massive inflation and interest rates north of 20%, is by providing them with preferential loans, or rather, getting Russian banks to do so, essentially indirectly financing the war economy using the public's bank savings. But those loans may now have piled a massive additional pool of debt on Russia's defence producers, which raises the spectre either of a future potential bailout, or the sector going through the kind of financial meltdown that swarms of Ukrainian drones couldn't achieve. The scale of the debt issue here is very hard to estimate. Chemezov says it's a problem, but doesn't specify how much of a problem. There are some estimates out there, however. US researcher Craig Kennedy, for example, reported that between 1 July 2022 and the end of November 2024, the increase in corporate debt in Russia could be valued at more than $400 billion, or about 20% of Russia's GDP. He also noted, unsurprisingly, that debts in war-related sectors appear to be growing almost 3 times faster on average than those in non-war-related sectors. Based on that, he suggests the Russian defence sector may have been propped up by preferential and non-preferential loans to the tune of between $210 and $250 billion, a number that would be significantly higher than Russia's official annual defence budget. Even if those numbers are accurate, none of that may be a problem for the defence sector as long as the war in Ukraine continues. Because as long as there's a war on, there's a pretty strong incentive on the Kremlin to do whatever is necessary in terms of financial shell games or support in order to keep the arms flowing. If we're trying to project what might happen to Russia's arms industry and its arms exports after the war is over, however, a massive debt burden, even if comparatively soft loans, might be a problem. And to that, I'd highlight 3 additional significant challenges. Firstly, the risk of protracted sanctions and market freezing out. If an eventual ceasefire or peace agreement doesn't provide significant sanctions relief, doesn't give Russian companies easy access to foreign capital, and doesn't make foreign buyers confident again purchasing Russian material, then any effort to re-enter the market in a big way is going to suffer a handicap. Issue 2 is that for some Russian products, especially cheaper, older systems, some of Russia's cost advantage for very budget-conscious buyers came from their ability to pull old equipment out of storage, refurbish and modernise it, and sell it for significantly less than other countries would be able to offer completely new-build equipment. With the war in Ukraine chewing through those Soviet storage yards, I'm not sure how much future there is in that particular model. And then finally, there's the basic challenge that a lot of Russia's defence industrial capacity that's been built up or activated since February 2022 isn't configured to turn out the kind of products that might be internationally competitive. Instead, especially when you're talking about ground combat systems, there's been a lot of reversion to older designs. Building a lot of your wartime model around the repair, reactivation and modernisation of old Soviet stock really just makes sense in the context of the kind of war that the Russian military has chosen to fight. But I'm really not sure what the international demand is going to be in 2032 for the T-72 Obrazets 2029. By comparison, we've mostly seen production of truly new Russian designs proceed at something of a glacial pace. Russian warship producers lose basically all of their international market share, and issues like sanctions and resource availability weigh pretty heavily on the production of Russia's newer weapon systems like the Sukhoi 57 and the Okhotnik. That said, I think there are a couple of areas Russia genuinely would be competitive on the market if industry was freed up to focus on export activity again. Russia has reportedly been fairly successful in scaling up production of TBMs like Iskander, for example, as well as new families of long-range attack drones and loitering munitions, and a lot of those systems appear to have performed quite effectively in Ukraine, caused the Ukrainian military a lot of difficulties, and in the case of Iskander in particular, proved to be a responsive, dangerous threat. So I can absolutely imagine the Russians finding new buyers for that production capacity if their own military didn't need every unit they could get their hands on. It's also now been claimed by Algerian state media that their country will be the first international buyer for Russia's Sukhoi 57, with reports claiming that 14 export versions of the jet will be purchased. That might hint that even in a very crowded international market, there might still be at least some demand for Russia's 5th-generation fighter. But at a big picture level, I'd argue that in many of the market segments where Russia used to compete relatively successfully, in the time they've spent focused on Ukraine, international competition has only stiffened. Leaving politics aside, Sukhoi 57 is going to find itself competing in a market featuring the likes of F-35, J-35, KF-21, and other competitors that might have the advantage of more scale and more technology behind them. And so as the war in Ukraine drags on, I'd argue the future of Russia's arms industry is very much uncertain. It clearly has some products that might sell well on the international market, but it's not sure when or if it'll gain free access to that market again. Likewise, it's not at all clear how the Kremlin will approach the industry once the pace of the fighting begins to slow. Will funding be forthcoming for decades to come as Russia attempts to rearm itself? Will some of these preferential loans be forgiven? Or at the other extreme, will industry be left to cannibalise and consolidate like it did in the 1990s? Russian industry so far has done a pretty good job of generating the output that Russia needs in the here and now. But what its future is after that wartime demand abates, only time will tell. While Russian arms exports have faltered as a result of the war in Ukraine, however, the US defence sector has had a very different experience. And at least until recent events caused some countries to start re-evaluating their strategy when it comes to purchasing US arms, American exports were locked in a pretty clear line-go-up scenario. Remember how this is the chart showing global arms exports as a whole, according to the SIPRI data, complete with that somewhat bumpy and shallow overall upwards trend? Yeah, this is the chart for US exports. A much clearer upwards trajectory that's particularly pronounced since 2022. And I think it's pretty telling that of the top 4 years for American arms transfers since 2010, 3 have occurred after Russia's full-scale invasion, in descending order 2022, 2024, 2017, and 2023. If you're looking for a statistical explanation of what we're seeing, it's a couple of factors coming together. At a high level, US producers aren't just following the global market up, they're taking a greater and greater share of it. Between 2011 and 2013, the United States accounted for roughly 30% of these tracked exports. In 2024, more than 2 years into Vladimir Putin's advertising campaign for NATO weapon systems, the number was closer to 47%. There are a couple of elements that probably went into that, from who's buying, which is something we'll discuss a little later, but also, importantly from an American perspective, what they're buying. From an international market perspective, it's fair to say there's a couple of things the US defence sector doesn't build well. US warships tend to be quite capable, yes, but also very expensive, and built by shipyards that struggle to keep up with the US Navy demand, let alone potential export customers. When the US floated the idea of transferring some second-hand littoral combat ships to Greece, for example, in early 2024, Greece's defence minister reportedly suggested that they would only take the ships if they were provided for free, with no conversion needs or costs, and assurances about their reliability, describing them as ships with, quote, numerous problems, end quote. But on the other hand, there are categories where the United States is the clear market leader, particularly in two very expensive categories that tend to dominate the international figures, aircraft and missiles. And a significant share of the uptick in US shipments has been built on those categories. The chart you can see on screen here shows the percentage share of annual missile transfers by three main sources: the United States, Russia, and literally everyone else. As you can see, Russia's percentage of sales fell off pretty hard over time, from more than 30% in the early 2010s to single-digit figures post-2022. Meanwhile, the US share moved from between 30 and 40% in the early 2010s to about 50% in 2022 and nearly 60% in 2024. And that increase in share has been made all the more significant by the fact that people are just buying more missiles than they did before. As you can see here, missile transfers spiked massively in the post-2022 environment, with 2024 transfers being very roughly double what they were in 2010. More share of a bigger market has been enough to push American missile shipments from around 1,000 TIV per annum in the early 2010s to more than 3,000 in 2023 and 2024. Aircraft are the other big category and consistently the largest in the overall arms transfer database. Here again, Russian transfers have crashed harder than Prigozhin's jet, while American transfers since 2022 have consistently exceeded 50% and sometimes 60% of the market. Aircraft transfers, as you can see here, haven't increased anywhere near as massively as missile ones, but given just how large the values are we're talking about here, even a relatively small increase in market share is enough to move the overall needle. Basically, the data suggests that in recent years, the US has become even more dominant in product categories it's usually pretty strong in, and those product categories now account for more of the overall market than they used to. And I think it's worth suggesting that one of the biggest factors holding back US transfers in 2024 and 2023 from being even higher than they were wasn't a lack of sales or customers, it was an absence of capacity. Even if the world is clamouring for as many Gimler's rockets as they can get their hands on, for example, unless customers were willing to catapult launch the things, production rate was always going to be limited by things like rocket motors. Scaling up the production of many critical inputs has been an ongoing effort. But the nature of complex weapon systems is such that if you have a weakness at any point in your supply chain, it's potentially going to pull back on your total output. Looked at from another angle though, customers wanting to buy more of your product than you can physically produce isn't the worst problem to have. And so a lot of the major US defense primes ended 2024 with reasons to be quite positive about the future and a massive order backlog. Lockheed Martin's order books, for example, ended the year backlogged $176 billion US dollars. For RTX, it was closer to 218 billion. The F-35, perhaps America's flagship defense product, had a pretty good sales year in 2024, with SIPRI tracking orders for around 90 aircraft for Greece, Romania, Israel, Singapore, and the Netherlands. At a production rate of around 156 F-35s per annum, keeping up with that kind of foreign order rate would require dedicating almost 60% of F-35 output, which can help keep that production line humming whether US-driven demand is going through a peak or a trough. That said, you could argue that projecting future US arms exports now is a lot more complicated than it was even a couple of months ago. And as the diplomatic fissure between the US and many of its allies have grown, so too have questions over whether they will continue to be as reliant as they have been on American weapon systems. In the short to medium term, there's still a lot of orders on the books to work their way through the system. The US is still its own largest buyer, and will likely remain so, even if the future trajectory of the defence budget is a bit uncertain at the moment. One risk from an industrial perspective then might simply be the possibility of missed opportunities because of a heightened level of uncertainty. If US firms can be really confident that their order books for foreign sales will continue to grow for years to come, then it might make sense to start investing now in additional production capacity so you can capture that demand in the future. But if you just don't know, you might choose to moderate your investment planning, meaning that even if those fears later prove to be groundless, you're not going to have the capacity in place to harvest all that demand. And you might not start building that capacity until the uncertainty starts to tamp down. But how factors like shifting global tensions or changing allied buying preferences affect the American order book in the longer term, I think it's probably still too early to tell. And we can probably be fairly certain about where some of that uncertainty is centred. So let's jump across the Atlantic and talk Europe. As we've discussed in some past episodes, Europe has been a major factor in the arms market for the last couple of years, both on the demand and supply side. On the demand side, Europe has been seeing some major increases in defence spending. with EU defence outlays rising about 30% between 2021 and 2024, even before the new US administration took office. Coupled with Ukraine's massive demands, that's helped cause the share of global arms exports going to countries in Europe to jump from around 10% in the early and mid-2010s to closer to 35% since the Russian invasion. That's made Europe, in regional terms, the single most important destination for international arms transfers, unseating both Asia and the famously stable Middle East. Many European nations have lifted their imports above pre-invasion levels, although the amount by which they've done so is by no means uniform. As you can see here, for some like Germany and Italy, the jump isn't that far above recent historical norms, while some like Hungary have dialed it up from basically zero, while Poland's basically been on the hunt for a military modernisation speedrun record. To give you a sense of scale here is an incomplete list of what SIPRI tracked the Poles receiving in 2024. 132 main battle tanks, 60 self-propelled guns, 36 multiple rocket launchers, 3 F-35s, more than 100 Patriot missiles, 2 Saab early warning aircraft, Gimlers and ATACMS rockets from the United States, helicopters from Italy, 250 Spike missiles from Israel, and 200 Hellfire missiles from the United States. But in part because a lot of European defence exports end up going to other European nations, 2022 through 24 saw a significant uptick in what European nations were sending out, not just what they were bringing in, with Germany, Italy and the United Kingdom all significantly boosting their numbers over 2019 through 2021 levels, which also helped push up Europe's share of overall international exports. Here the trend has played out pretty consistently since the early 2010s. In the years immediately following Russia's occupation of Crimea, Europe's share of the market jumped from around 20% to roughly 25%. And then in 2022 through 2024, the number was getting closer to 30%. Note here the little asterisk next to Europe indicates we're talking about a subset of the major European arms exporters, not all European nations, meaning we are including the United Kingdom, but excluding the likes of Turkey, Austria and Switzerland. Even after the Russian 2022 invasion acted as a bit of a wake-up call, however, a lot of European defence producers were still dealing with some pretty systemic issues. High levels of fragmentation, difficult regulation, limited economies of scale, often a high cost base, and other factors that sometimes made it difficult to compete against other providers, including the United States, when it came to particular weapons categories. That said, there were some categories where European providers had been doing very well and continue to do so in 2024. While the US Navy is still the global standard, and there's a joke or two out there about the wisdom of touching America's boats, statistically speaking, if countries are looking to buy warships or submarines, they're much more likely to look to Europe. Because the delivery timelines for warships and submarines tend to be quite low, and the delivery timelines long, what I've done for this chart is extend the time periods, 2011 through 2016 on the left, and 2019 through 24 on the right. And what you can see is those major European providers going from having a narrow majority in the first time period at around 55% to a clear supermajority around 75% of the market from 2019 onwards. In that sense, European shipyards essentially became a kind of default choice, with Russia's market share essentially disappearing to be partially taken over by the People's Republic of China, and US military shipbuilding doing what US military shipbuilding does, leaving European military shipyards as the de facto default option for a range of systems types. One might suggest this kind of production capacity, along with that of Japan and South Korea, might potentially be useful if some hypothetical superpower ever found itself locked in a naval building race against a shipbuilding juggernaut like the People's Republic of China, but what are the odds of that happening? The balance between the various European naval producers hasn't shifted that much over the course of the last 2 decades, with the major changes, as you can see there, being the fall in the UK share, compensated for by increased French and Spanish deliveries. Part of the explanation here is that both France and Germany are major exporters of conventional submarines, while the UK, which is in the business of running an all-nuclear submarine fleet, didn't warm up to the prospect of exporting any of those until very recently, with results that won't likely show themselves in this kind of data until the 2040s. At a big picture level, if you're looking at the European 2024 data, it's clear there are both some challenges and opportunities on the horizon. Challenges in that, especially in the naval domain, competition out of Asia is getting far more intense. The final showdown over a multi-billion-dollar contract to build new frigates for the Royal Australian Navy, for example, isn't between 2 European firms. It's Germany versus shipbuilding giant Japan. And so how European producers will fare in the face of greater and greater competition in some of their traditional areas of dominance, only time will tell. But on the flip side, it's also clear that a lot more European defence spending might be on the horizon, and that increasingly many European leaders are looking to their defence sectors not as a nice-to-have, but as a core part of their national survival strategy. None of that surge in funding, or the push to buy European, is reflected in the 2024 data. But as we'll talk about a little bit later in the episode, it might have a massive impact on what comes next. Pivoting away from Europe then, I think it's time to look at Asia and its largest defence industrial giant, the People's Republic of China. The big contextual point here, when you talk about China and its relationship with global arms markets, is a decades-long effort to modernise technologically and become much more self-reliant. If you go back to the Cold War and immediate post-Cold War period, China was actually a major arms importer, specifically reliant on Soviet and later Russian arms. A significant amount of Chinese equipment, especially hard-to-manufacture things like aircraft engines, were often imported wholesale, while many Chinese-produced designs were derivative of Soviet or Russian models. By 2024, though, I think it was pretty clear in a lot of systems categories that technological relationship had flipped. The PRC no longer needed to have an importer relationship with Moscow on the same scale, because in many cases its domestic products were good enough, or in some cases even better. We touched on some of the numbers a little bit earlier in the introduction, but taking the long view here really gives you a sense of scale. According to SIPRI, between 2001 and 2004, the PRC imported about 11,115 TIV worth of military products. 20 years later, between 2021 and 2024, that number was down about 84% to 1,835. And in 2024, the number for the year was 72, down roughly 88% on 2022 levels, and lower than any recorded point since 1987, when the Chinese defence budget wasn't exactly what it is now. Part of the story here, beyond just Russia's currently export-challenged state, is that Beijing appears to have been doing a pretty good job in breaking some of those last import dependencies. For example, the major sticking point for many years was aircraft engines. Building an effective, reliable jet engine for modern fighters is hard. But by throwing enough time, resources, and engineering talent at the problem, China appears to have made serious progress. In 2024, for example, we saw new photos of China's J-20 flying with new domestically produced WS-15 engines, which is notable not just because of what it might signal about the performance of future J-20s, but also about the capabilities of Chinese industry, and with it, China's relationship with some of its past suppliers. While China has been immensely successful in slashing its imports, however, the change in its export figures is far less dramatic. As you can see on the chart there, shipments in the 2022 to 2024 period might look like a massive leap over 2019 through 21, but primarily because 2019 through 21 was a bit of a slump for Chinese exports. If you compare recent years instead to the early or mid-2010s, there's still an increase there, but a much less dramatic one. Across the periods we're looking at, China's share of overall exports has never exceeded 10%, and a lot of the time has been closer to 5 than 10. And of those exports we do know about, the overwhelming majority go to a relatively small club of buyers. Between 2022 and 2024, for example, more than 60% of Chinese exports in TIV terms went to just Pakistan. Almost 90% went to only 6, Pakistan, plus Serbia, Thailand, Algeria, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And when a single order from Mauritania for surface-to-air missile systems can make up 10% of your deliveries, as it did for China in 2024, that might not be a sign that you have the most robust possible set of customers. From a first principles perspective, the challenge of that relatively narrow customer base for Chinese arms is at least twofold. On one hand, it can make scaling sales difficult unless you can find new customers. There's only so much a country like Pakistan, for example, is going to be able to afford. The other issue is that all else being equal, the fewer buyers you have, the harder a deal they might be able to drive. And the more vulnerable your sales potentially are to changes in politics, economic circumstances, or assessed military need in any of those countries. In China's case, though, I think it's important not to overemphasize those potential risks, just because exports are such a small part of the Chinese defense output overall. Every year, China's defense industrial base turns out an immense amount of materiel, but rather than selling a lot of it, the overwhelming majority goes straight to the PLA. On one hand, that might just be a sign of priorities, Beijing equipping its own forces ahead of trying to sell more systems overseas. But given China's industrial capacity, I'm not sure how certain I'd be they couldn't just scale production further if the prospect of profitable sales was there. Part of the problem may be geopolitical. A lot of the major importers out there might be reluctant to choose China as a primary supplier. If you thought the Canadians were nervous about the bloody F-35, imagine how India or Germany might feel about the prospect of bringing in Chinese fighter jets. For countries that already operate Western systems, integration is likely to be a problem. And of course, unlike a lot of competitor systems that have been previously used in conflicts, including in Ukraine, many modern Chinese designs aren't going to have a combat record. But that doesn't mean we won't see Chinese producers working very hard to win additional market share. Chinese firms are increasingly a major presence at international defence exhibitions, and the country's product offering has continued to evolve rapidly. And there are areas where arguably China already has a massive industrial advantage. The country dominates the small civilian drone market, is a major producer of larger military types, and is arguably ahead of the United States and Europe when it comes to actually fielding things like stealthy UCAVs, which might potentially present more of an export opportunity for China if international demand for those kind of systems ramps up. In the short to medium term then, I think it's safe to assume that Chinese producers will keep most of their sights squarely focused on the domestic market. The PLA is spending big on modernisation and determined to use Chinese weapons to do it. But the path forward on exports probably comes down as much to what new customers China is able to attract, not just the products it's able to offer. If we're willing to indulge in a little bit of long-range speculation though, one wonders if it might be worth observers keeping a close eye on Moscow as a potential future buyer of Chinese defence products. It's been suggested some Western planners are already operating on the assumption that things like Chinese sensors and Chinese surface-to-air missile systems will eventually enter Russian inventory, and it remains to be seen whether Moscow, presumably after the war in Ukraine, ultimately reaches the same conclusion. If so, it would arguably represent a bit of a poignant reversal of the old Soviet-era industrial relationship between the two countries. But for the moment, based on the 2024 data, future sales, at least beyond the ATV and golf cart categories, are still up in the air. Moving on, out of necessity, to avoid this video running for hours, I've had to focus most of what we've discussed so far on the main exporters. But I do think it's worth quickly highlighting the importance of another phenomenon we've seen over the last couple of years, which you might call the rise of the rest. Because the combination of some nations pushing hard towards more domestic capability, coupled with a Russia-sized void in the market and a demand picture so strained that even Uncle Sam's Arms Bazaar is keeping a long waiting list, precisely as some nervous governments race to get strapped as fast as possible, means there's been significant space for some of the smaller producers to carve out significant niches in the market. South Korea, for example, has increasingly become an actor not just in traditional areas like shipbuilding, but also armour, artillery, missiles and aircraft. Between 2011 and 2013, their exports totalled 771 TIV, and in 2022 through 24, 1,817. And their industrial strategy of embracing technology transfer and establishing production in other countries potentially leaves them even more space to compete in key markets like Europe going forward. One of Seoul's chosen industrial partners is, of course, Warsaw. And the Poles, for their part, have proven very willing to supply Ukraine, not just with older Warsaw Pact-era equipment, but also more modern, domestically produced Polish designs that are seeing combat for the first time. Things like the Krab self-propelled gun and the Rosamark IFV. In 2011 through 13, Poland shipped about 211 TIV. In 2022 through 24, 1,428 that we know about. Turkey, meanwhile, is another case of a country that's pushed hard to indigenize as many defence production capabilities as possible. And while they've started to export equipment across a range of categories, drones are a segment where Turkish products have become particularly famous. As Turkish arms imports have dropped, their exports have risen, from less than 440 TIV between 2011 and 2013, and more than 1,600 over the last 3 years. Israel's another case of a country which has seen strong sales and a growth in order backlog for some of its major defence producers, with some of the biggest deliveries in 2024 being for surface-to-air missile systems. But a point to add on the end here is that even in the current precarious security environment where demand levels are pretty high, that doesn't mean it's a case of line go up for every producer in the market. Switzerland, for example, is a pretty strong case in point. This is a country in Europe that's historically had a well-developed arms sector and a strong record of international exports, at a time where a lot of neighbouring states are willing to spend big, and yet in the midst of a European arm build-up, Swiss exports are actually down. And I don't mean a little bit down, although the scale does really depend on what weapons category you're talking about. Between 2022 and 2024, Swiss export deliveries have been about a third of what they were in the years leading up to Crimea, and only about a quarter of what they were between 2014 and 2016. There's a lot that goes into explaining that, including the natural bumpiness of the data and the nature of some of these contracts. But reportedly, both Switzerland's State Secretariat for Economic Affairs and various industry figures point the finger, at least in part, to Switzerland's neutrality policy. That's seen Switzerland deny various countries that had previously bought Swiss weapons or Swiss ammunition, for example, permission to re-export those to Ukraine. In some cases, that de facto forced other countries to cut in on what was previously Swiss market share. The country was the primary producer for ammunition for the Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, for example, until they refused to allow Swiss-manufactured ammunition to be sent to Ukraine, forcing Germany to rapidly restart production of Gepard ammunition so Ukrainian operators would have options other than ramming attacks. Perhaps the public highlight in this saga around Swiss neutrality issues came in early 2023, when the Swiss president reportedly famously said, quote, "Swiss weapons must not be used in wars," end quote. Which some might suggest is kind of core to the reasons that nations often buy weapons. You're not often going to fork out millions of dollars per unit for armoured vehicles, just so your troops have something unique to take through the Macca's drive-through. And the Swiss have subsequently struggled to win major contracts in the way they once did. Now again in 2025, it's reported there's some debate in Switzerland about whether the country's rules should be revised. But I bring this up not to focus too much on the Swiss case itself, but rather because of what it demonstrates. The data is pretty clear that there's a lot more to defence export success than just the technical characteristics of your system. Politics matters, reliability matters, and the confidence on the part of the receiving party they'll receive what they paid for, the support necessary to maintain it, and the permissions necessary to use it in a way which aligns with their own national objectives can be just as important, if not more so. Which is why when you're trying to model future sales, it can pay to consider soft factors like perceived reliability, not just the hard factors like cost, performance, and delivery timeline. While I think all this data is very useful, however, I do think there are a couple of elements that it potentially glosses over. And it comes back to both what's not in the data and what's not yet in the data. Leaving out some simpler munitions like unguided artillery shells obviously makes sense if you don't want to go insane compiling a database like this, but I also think it accidentally serves to conceal part of the way the market has changed post-invasion of Ukraine. A significant chunk of the military assistance going to Ukraine, and a lot of the military assistance going to Russia from places like North Korea, has been the artillery shells and barrels necessary to keep artillery on both sides firing. It's been mortar rounds and grenades. And omitting that doesn't just miss out a critical supply factor for the war in Ukraine, it also misses out where a significant amount of investment, industrial effort, and future sales might be going. Since 2022, for example, the US and Europe haven't dramatically increased their production of things like fighter aircraft or warships. But after a delayed start and even more delayed funding, we've started to see dramatic growths in some of those simpler munition categories. Most indications are that from a pre-war production rate of around 14,000 155mm shells per year, the US has now lifted that rate at least 5 times and aims to exceed 100,000 shells per month this year. The European Union, meanwhile, eventually hit its 1 million target and is talking about going to 2 million this year. So while yes, these munitions can be cheaper than more complex systems, there's a lot of growth that we're not capturing here. And even if the demand caused by the war in Ukraine itself ends tomorrow, there's quite possibly a long tail of future transfers here. Ukraine will want to build up its stockpile, the various donor nations will want to rebuild their stockpiles, and then even once militaries have rebuilt to that baseline, there are a lot of signs that countries and the NATO alliance more broadly are looking at the war in Ukraine and potentially just about any conventional conflict of the industrial era and concluding that running out of ammunition can lead to suboptimal battlefield performance. That suggests there may be a demand sink here for all of this additional production for years to come, even if active conflicts don't keep burning through all the stockpiles. Another major absence from the picture, which is becoming more major day by day, is the importance of small UAS. Yes, FPVs or small repurposed civilian quadrotors might have seemed like a bit of a budgetary afterthought back in 2022, at a point where some people were shocked to hear reports they might be being lost at a rate of 10,000 per month. When you're talking about Russia and Ukraine both setting production targets in the millions for 2025, the Ukrainians put forward 4 million as a target figure, it's impossible to ignore that market segment, nor the importance of who's coming to dominate it. Next to an $80 million F-35, a $600 drone is a rounding error. But budget for 4 million of the things, and you're talking about an outlay that could get you 30 jets at $80 million per. And the disruptive effect of this newer procurement category isn't just driven by the fact that they're cheap, affordable, accessible, and undoubtedly effective. It's also driven by the fact they're still evolving extremely rapidly. That means who's going to dominate this market segment and how it's going to affect future arms transfer patterns is still very much up in the air. Drones are an accessible technology. You don't need an industrial base capable of building a 5th-generation fighter in order to have a crack at the military drone market. And we don't yet know who's going to take the lead at any given time in bringing together emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous guidance, swarming, and bring those together into the kind of offerings that militaries are going to want to buy and then keep buying. It's an area where the Ukrainians and the Russians are obviously going to have a significant advantage just by sheer volume of experience. But while the market leaders in many systems categories have been the market leaders for decades at this point, I'd argue the drone race is still only getting started, and the data isn't clear yet who's going to find themselves standing on the podium. What's very clear, though, is that on the future battlefield, the drones are going to be there. And I think that means a potentially emerging and long-term demand picture for systems required to counter those drones. That might mean, for example, short-range air defense systems that have access to options other than expensive missiles for bringing down incoming drones or loitering munitions. Pre-2022, many militaries had deprioritised that kind of system. Germany retired the last of its Gepards in 2012, only to roll them out again and send them to Ukraine, because it turns out they're pretty effective drone hunters. And for some of the systems that countries might want to build or access through imports in order to deal with emerging drone threats, the long-cherished option of coasting on someone else's Cold War-era leftovers might not be available because the technologies are so new that there are no legacy systems. If you want high-energy lasers or high-powered microwaves, for example, that are actually practical for CUAS use, unless you know of any buried alien weapon caches, raiding a stockpile isn't going to be an option. And so just as it remains to be seen who's ultimately going to win out in the field of military drone or loitering munitions sales, I'd suggest we're also not entirely sure yet who's going to corner the market on stopping them, which I think naturally segues us into some closing observations, both in terms of what the 2024 data can tell us and what we might see from the arms import and export market going forward. I think a big observation up front is that when it comes to data like this, even extreme events don't necessarily change things overnight. Yes, you might observe Russian deliveries falling off a cliff, for example, but there are still going to be older orders working their way through the system that prevent them collapsing further. You might see massive investments in ramping up production, but until that production actually comes online, you don't see it reflected in the final delivery figures. And so while the 2024 data shows some changes from before the Russian invasion, I think it's worth reflecting on how some upward pressure on future numbers might already be baked in. You have massive order backlogs in many cases, which means that even if governments were to tap the brakes tomorrow, which doesn't exactly appear to be happening, you'd still see all of that book demand flowing into the delivery figures for years. We're also seeing a lot of major militaries fight what must at times feel like a losing battle against one of their greatest enemies, the linear passage of time. With every year that passes, major platforms, whether that be aircraft, submarines or warships built before the peace dividend, get that much closer to the point of aging out completely. And in the case of the Russians, who've had to run a lot of their equipment a lot harder as a result of the war in Ukraine, that process is even more accelerated. That might leave forces that have been partly coasting on inventories from that era for decades at this point, with a couple of potentially imperfect options. They can try and apply the same kind of life extension necromancy that we see with the B-52 or the Tu-95 to other systems, although for a lot of systems that might not be practical or be more expensive than getting something entirely new. They could retire systems without replacement and downscale their forces, but you can probably imagine a lot of decision makers being reluctant to do that, given the current global security environment vaguely resembles the "this is fine" meme. Or they can try and get their hands on new material, which in a lot of cases, out of necessity, is going to have to be imported. I also think the stage has been set for some other shifts in market dynamics beyond just what is being demanded. The big one here, with the potential to have changes for years to come, is what we've seen happening in Europe. Specifically, higher expected levels of defence spending, especially now the German parliament has signed off on those changes to the debt brake that we discussed last week, and on the other hand, a much greater emphasis on using that new funding to buy European. A shift towards a focus on European systems might potentially have long-term implications for the demand for American systems, but also for international competition more broadly, with European producers potentially benefiting from more funding and more scale, and potentially a more attractive pitch on the international market, especially if other nations decide they too might want to be a little bit less reliant on American products. If we're trying to figure out the odds of that actually happening, there are a couple of things we might want to watch for in 2025. The first would be additional defence alliances, defence purchases, or industrial cooperation agreements between different traditional buyers of American weapons. Remember that in a lot of cases, a core challenge here is simply going to be that the US has the kind of scale in research and development and production that nations not named the People's Republic of China are generally going to struggle to match. Greater cooperation then between the likes of Canada, the United Kingdom, and European Union might be one way to potentially try and at least partially offset that scale advantage. Another example would be any kind of shift, be it incremental or dramatic, towards a common European defence market, where a lot more focus is put on joint selection and procurement across the bloc, as well as genuine competition for those procurements between various national firms. A key potential political challenge there, of course, is that by opening up the market within the European Union, countries could lose some of their ability to tailor their specifications and favour domestic industry, which for some states might create a difficult national security policy trade-off. How much national self-reliance are you willing to risk in order to further the cause of European self-reliance? However that policy question resolves, in the short to medium term at least, we're probably looking at a demand spike, and with some European leaders reportedly suggesting a 2030 deadline to resolve some of the continent's capability gaps, that potentially leaves a lot of procurement backlog to be filled relatively quickly, one way or another. Under ordinary circumstances, that would probably mean a lot of contracts going to American firms. And to be fair, given the performance requirements, timelines and supply squeeze, we probably should expect to see additional European purchases from the United States. That said, these aren't particularly ordinary times. With some recent US statements, like for example President Trump saying of the American F-47 that the US might consider selling a slightly downgraded version to allies, quote, because someday maybe they're not our allies, end quote, being the kind of thing that might nudge potential buyers of US systems to at least consider all of their options. To be clear, the idea of nerfing your equipment before exporting it is nothing new. It's also historically not that uncommon. And most buyers will generally understand what they're paying for and what they get. The anxiety-inducing part of that statement from a foreign perspective isn't the downgraded model part, it's the maybe they won't be allies part. It may be technically true, but it still might make a couple of allies nervous to hear the quiet part said out loud. And so while we should expect to see a couple of years of more strong delivery data coming out of the US, at least unless we see the diplomatic situation degrade to a point where buyers cancel existing orders for US weapon systems en masse, rather than just reconsidering how reliant they want to be on the US for their major weapon systems going forward. But whatever the case on that point, I'd suggest that a lot of the ingredients might be in place for a very dynamic market going forward. You have a potential uptick in European demand and plenty of reasons for producers around the world to attempt to fight for as large a share of it as possible. Old assumptions around what capabilities various buyers might be willing to pay for being blown out of the water. For example, when it comes to things like sovereign space-based assets or critical enablers that previously countries might have been willing to rely on the United States for, at a time when military technology and assumptions are shifting so rapidly, that there might be serious opportunities out there for startups or smaller producers that don't have the resources of the established defence primes, but which might be able to identify an opportunity, move quickly, and stake out a market position, selling something new or improved. Which ones ultimately succeed, however, and how that might impact the national level statistics, is something that only the passage of time, and the 2025 data when we get it, will ultimately tell. And okay, brief channel update to close out. Firstly, let me apologise for the slight delay in releasing this episode. This wasn't originally the one that was meant to release in this time slot, but as I was reviewing the episode that was meant to go live, I just wasn't happy with how it was coming together. I am very, very aware that in this busy world, an hour is a lot of time to give up to a defence industrial PowerPoint on the internet. And so I want to make sure that insofar as is possible, when I release these things, they're worth the time that people choose to put into them. What I decided to do then was push that other episode back a few months so I can rework it into something I can genuinely be proud of, and bring this episode forward instead. Obviously, finishing up an episode and polishing it for release does take some time, hence the one-day delay. Thank you again for your understanding, and we should be back to Sunday releases this week. Speaking of which, even though this coming Sunday doesn't fall on April 1st itself, it is as close as we're going to get. As such, as is YouTube tradition, we're going to be doing a bit more of a light-hearted episode. What exactly that means, however, is up to you, the viewers. By the time this goes live, there should be a community poll posted where you can make your vote between a couple of topics that I've had prepped for times like this one. I can't guarantee I'll respect the democratic process if there are strong arguments to the contrary, but I will check the results of that vote after a day or so and take your recommendations strongly under advisement. I think that's everything for now, so thank you again all of you for your ongoing support and engagement. Please do vote in a poll if you'd like some influence over what you see next episode, and whatever the results, I hope to see you all again this week.